Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to Psycho Bible, babbling about psychology and theology. And I am honored today to have a guest, Joe Dallas, a big hero of mine in the field of ministry for those with sexual struggles, such as same-sex attraction or just pornography and sexual addiction issues, and a prolific author, a leader in ministry. And so I am blessed to have him on the show today and just to share about his life experiences and his years of experience in ministry. I was inspired several months ago to start connecting with some of the seasoned veterans of this particular ministry field that we both are involved in, ministry to people leaving the LGBT. And over the past couple of years, we've seen some of the stalwarts graduate to heaven, such as Frank Worthen and Cy Rogers. And I don't want to take any of these guys for granted. So I'm going to swing for the fences and try to reach out to some of these heroes of mine and glean some wisdom from them while we are blessed to have them in our midst. So, Joe, I'm just honored to have you with me. I gave a little bit there, but if you could just maybe share briefly just your elevator pitch bio of who you are and what you do.
Sure, that was a fun intro. I really enjoyed it. It was sort of like, yeah, let's catch the old man while he's still here.
I didn't want to, want to be careful how I word it, but
hey, I've heard. No, honestly, Andrew, I love it. I sometimes have to bite my tongue. Sometimes you'll go to a conference and somebody will say, I just appreciate the fact that you've been here for years and years and years and years and years and years. And I think, okay, I get it. Fine. Yeah. Your grandfather read Desires in Conflict when he was a teenager. Okay, that's good to know. No. Hey, I've been honored. And I, if I was going to have a testimonial gravestone, it would say something like, I was honored even though I dishonored. Because much of my life was spent dishonoring God. And let me explain that. Like a lot of people who you've known, and I'm sure who you've worked with, I came to Christ at an early age, Andrew. And by the time I did, I was very aware that I was attracted to men. I was 16 years old when I first heard the gospel. I had already had a number of relationships with men. Unfortunately, as a boy, I had been routinely molested. And then as a teen, I started actually going on dates, believe it or not, with adult men through a sort of gay underground network at the time. This was 1970, 1971. So it was a very different landscape at the time. But the point is, I had begun identifying myself as gay. I'd even come out to a few people, which, hey, at that time, that could get you killed, but that's what I did. And then a girl who I also was dating invited me out to Calvary Chapel, Pastor Chuck Smith's church in Costa Mesa, California. This was right at the burgeoning phase of the Jesus movement. Thousands upon thousands of kids were getting saved at the time. It was amazing. And I was born again then. I thought that being born again would mean all temptations would cease, especially sexual ones. And because in 1971, people didn't tend to be talking about this openly, I really thought I was the only guy in the church who had this struggle. And that led me to, on the one hand, try very hard to pretend that the struggle wasn't there. On the other hand, I had a real zeal for ministry. And this is why I emphasize that element of dishonoring God. I was actually in full-time ministry as a very young man, as many young people were raised up during that Jesus movement revival. And I was living a very sanctified life in a lot of ways. And I also married very young at age 18, very foolishly. And my wife and I were both very dedicated to the ministry. But my life tended to be one-dimensional in that I basically was trying so hard to be spiritual. I pretty much pretended I didn't have any human feelings or conflicts or temptations. She and I were married for about 6 years. I left the ministry, which is a whole other saga, but it was a ministry that got too big too quickly, and a lot of worldliness crept into it, and I felt I couldn't continue with it. But shortly after that, I gave myself permission at age 23 to start looking at pornography. And it was around that time that my wife and I separated, and then I began having liaisons with men. And she filed for divorce, rightfully so. And I went whole hog into the gay community first, and then into a pro-gay church, and then into gay activism. So during those years, as a backslidden Christian, I tried very hard to convince myself and anybody who would listen to me that homosexuality was compatible with Christianity until early 1984. And that's when I realized, by the grace of God, I had been kidding myself. And that was the beginning of a season of repentance. And then I got some very good Christian counseling, which I was in for a couple of years. I then met my wife, Renee, who I've been married to since 1987. And around 87, through a fluke, I began doing work similar to what you're doing, Andrew. I did not intend to. I wanted to actually study and then become licensed as a counselor to work in the area of chemical dependency, because that runs in my family. And I've been a drug abuser myself, was for years when I was a teenager. So I could not find any internships that would take me. The only internship available through my master's program was one that was dealing with people who were struggling with homosexuality. That's how I got into this field, not because I chose to, because of my own testimony. I wanted to put that behind me, but God clearly had other plans. And so I accepted that internship with the stipulation I'd only do it for about 6 months. But then as it started to take off, I realized what many of us came to realize in the ensuing years. There are quite a few people within the Christian population who are silently wrestling with homosexual desires and feel they have nowhere to go. And that's when I realized, my gosh, this could really become full-time ministry. And it did. And in the ensuing years, I've had the honor of writing and speaking and walking alongside women and men who are on a journey similar to the one I was on. So that is somewhat the Reader's Digest version of it, but that's how I came to become involved in this kind of work.
That's a good bird's eye view of everything, because there's aspects of that I want to drill down into a little bit. I think one thing stands out to me. You didn't become a Christian until like your late teens?
I was 16 years old when I was born again.
Okay. So what was your home environment like? Were you raised in a Christian home? Was it religious in any way?
No. In the 60s, Christianity was, I guess as it somewhat is today, a very cultural term. To say you were a Christian basically meant you were a nice American who went to church. There was no talk about salvation. We were not an overtly Christian family. Certainly there were Christian principles played out in my home, and I bless my father and my mother for the work ethic that was instilled in me from early in life. I do praise God for that. That's valuable. And there were many good elements of my family life. It was a very comfortable, even a very privileged life. My father actually owned a Chevrolet agency, did very well for himself. I was raised on a private country club. So the lifestyle was very good. I would have to say it was not what I call a healthy home. It was in many ways a highly dysfunctional one. And I grew up feeling very inferior. I think that was just sort of the overriding theme of my childhood was I'm inferior. I'm stupider than most guys. I'm less likable than most guys. I'm awkward. And so I always felt like I was looking up to everybody. And that I was sort of the beggar at the table who hopefully would get a few crumbs. And that was my mindset for, I'd say, really at least the first 20 some odd years of my life. So long and short of it, no, it was not a healthy environment, certainly not a nightmare, and in many ways very privileged. But I would have to say it is not a family life I would want for my own sons and the family that I've been able to raise.
And so coming from that background and then having sexual struggles or having all these, you're dealing with promiscuity of both sorts, both with men and women.
I was.
And so what was the cultural attitude regarding sex and sexual morality at that time in those growing up years?
I'm glad you asked, because I think the cultural morality of any given time, you know what, it's sort of like a big old textbook that everybody's reading.
Mm-hmm.
My textbook was the early to mid 60s, where we were just about to jump into the swinging 60s and the beginning of the sexual revolution. It was the era of James Bond, Hugh Hefner, you
Mm-hmm.
see, Playboy magazine. It was just becoming cool to fornicate, to put it plainly.
Yeah.
It was even becoming cool to be involved in adultery. So those kinds of lascivious behaviors were largely being legitimized. My hero was James Bond. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
both because he was such a great fighter and such an adventuresome guy, but also because he bedded the women. And that was like, that's the mark of a real man. And in fact, although as a child I was sexually molested, when I came into my adolescence, my first sexual experiences were with girls, not with men. So there was always some level of attraction. I don't think I was ever what you technically would call bisexual, but the longer I live, the less inclined I am to just box everybody into one particular label. I think that there is a good deal of fluidity in sexual response. I think one of the chaotic errors of this time is to think that whatever chaotic desires you're feeling must be the right ones to engage. That's not true.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that many people are capable of a number of different types of responses. And so I did pursue sexual relations with girls. And then as I got into my mid-teens, I'd say 14, 15 especially, I began having sexual experiences with adult men. And I think for me, boy, Andrew, validation had a lot to do with my behavior, at least as much to do as erotic pleasure. I was a very sensual kid. I did a lot of drugs. I loved music and arts, and I loved sports. I loved things that were, among other things, sensual, and I loved sex of any kind. I mean, that for me, I had an enormous appetite.
Mm.
And as a result, though, I found that sex, well, in retrospect, I'd have to say, I have found that sex for me growing up was largely a means to an end rather than the end itself.
Mm.
It was for me largely about validation and largely about identity. If somebody wanted me sexually, oh, then maybe I'm okay, you see. And it also largely played into my identity. Oh, you see, I am a guy. Look what I just did, you know. And I think these were sort of false things I was using to prop myself up, because from within, I didn't even know who the heck Joe Dallas was. But if I could at least emulate James Bond and seduce a girl, as pathetic as that sounds, or if I could be desired by a man, I'm being fathered and I'm in turn living out masculinity, and it was an insane attempt. It's sort of like, God said through Isaiah, why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? I think that's in Isaiah 55. And I think that's what this kid, Joey Dallas, was doing. I went by the name Joey at the time.
Huh.
And so I think that for me, discovering sexual pleasure was not just a matter of discovering whether I was attracted to girls or guys. It was also largely about discovering a way to fill this void within.
Mm-hmm.
And so lust for me, and acting out my lust, was in its own way medicinal, anesthetic, very confirming, pumped me up in a lot of ways. I guess that's the bottom line.
No, I love how you said some of that, because right now I'm doing a series on what is love. We have to define what love is. We have such a distorted view of love in our culture, and our church has been ill prepared to answer that question. And what you're indicating there is kind of how you weren't loving these people you're engaging with. You're using them.
Certainly.
To love is to want to give to others, to be a gift, to will the good of the other. But when you're using them to get validation for yourself, to get your masculinity needs met, and your affirmation and acceptance and approval of who you are as a man, or just as a person in general, that's where you're using. It's I mean, that's the core of what lust is.
Oh,
To use
yeah.
rather than to love. So that
The
ties to the
irony
point.
of that, Andrew, is that I would frequently tell people I loved them.
Hmm.
I didn't know what I was talking about. I loved what I was experiencing with them. So there
Yeah.
was love there, but not for anybody but me. That was the great error. It was such an ecstatic thing, emotionally as well as erotically, that I would blurt out, "I love you." I did not, but I loved what I was experiencing with that person. I mean, I may as well have been riding a really good roller coaster and saying, "I love this roller coaster." Well, only because of what I was getting out of it. There was no relationship I could have with a roller coaster. And I guess that was true of the people I was with, certainly.
Yeah. So at some point, you then become a gay rights activist. What was the whole gay rights movement like at that period?
Mm-hmm.
For you to have joined it in some way? Was it burgeoning? Was it at its infancy? Or was it at a peak? So, I mean, I know around that time also is when they were effective enough to remove homosexuality from the DSM. So there was enough
That came
pressure
before I
on the
came
APA.
along, but yes, you're right, 1973. My activist years were the late 70s into the early 80s. And by then, activism still had a different complexion largely than what it has now. But I would have to say, Andrew, there were elements of gay rights activism at the time, even before I came along, going back to really the earliest efforts to reclassify homosexuality with the APA. There were elements of gay rights activism that were very, bullying, really. But that was the minority. That was the exception. Most of it, when I was a part of it, was about asking for things that seemed reasonable. Don't criminalize us just for being gay. Don't arrest us in a bar just because I had my hand on a guy's shoulder. Don't beat us up in the streets. Don't blackmail us. Don't treat us like scum. I mean, it seemed much more like a plea for decency and fair treatment. But laced in with my kind of activism, especially though, was a deeply ingrained belief that we were the victims and that the church was largely the source of our victimhood. The broader church, the Christian population, was the enemy because they believed that homosexuality was a sin. And they thereby influenced the culture to believe it's a sin, and the culture thereby hated us. Now, I had it all wrong. I've come to see, actually, that the cultural contempt for homosexuality, I am convinced, was much more birthed from the culture itself than from any kind of Christian conviction. Because there's nothing in scripture that says, go beat up gay people, call them queers, treat them like scum. That's not biblical. That's not a Christian message. That was a cultural prejudice that at times I think infected the church. But the church, the true body of Christ, I do not believe ever gave birth to that prejudice. I think that the church at times may have co-opted it, but certainly the church was not the enemy. But I guess this is an important point. For me, Andrew, it was convenient to see the church as the enemy. Because obviously what I was doing at the same time was trying to drown out the message of the church that was true, that I had learned as a teenager. And so my conscience was testifying against me. And since I didn't want to hear what my conscience was saying, I made an enemy out of not only my own conscience, but anybody who was saying what my conscience was trying to tell me. So that led to my sort of feeling of us versus them with the church. So in the plainest terms, at that time, gay activism meant running student unions on college campuses, debating Christians or conservatives on college campuses, marching in parades, doing radio interviews. That was what gay activism largely was at the time. It was not about basically, some of the stormtrooper tactics we saw in later years. But still, I was thoroughly deceived, but I was deceived because I had first made a decision to take myself outside of God's will. I was in rebellion. The rebellion set me up for the deception. You see what I mean?
Yeah, and then at what point were you serving on staff at the Metropolitan Community Church, the gay church that we all,
yes.
the original
Well, I thought that
church.
would be the answer, you know. I mean, to me, it sounded just great. Hey, there's a whole new way of interpreting the Bible. I love it because the Bible was the big bugaboo to me. I was trying to convince myself it was all right to be gay. And the first year I was out as a gay man, I just said, to heck with God, to heck with Christianity, to heck with all of it. I just want to indulge. And that obviously I can't do that and be a Christian, so forget it. After a year, I missed what I had had as a Christian. And that's when somebody told me I wouldn't have to choose between the two. That's when I visited the gay church. Now, I got on staff there fairly quickly because I'd had some ministerial experience. I also played the piano. That got me involved in their music program. And then I signed up for what they at that time called the student minister program. If you wanted to become a minister with the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. Just a quick note on that. In the late 70s and before that, really, there wasn't much out there if you wanted a gay affirming church besides the Metropolitan Community Churches. That denomination was founded in 1968 by an openly gay minister who had been with the Church of God, was defrocked over homosexuality, then wound up starting his own denomination. And it was a very mixed bag. It was very eclectic. It had Catholic elements in the way that the ministers dressed. It had people there from all different denominations. In fact, what I've often said is that in the congregations themselves, everybody seemed to be a former Southern Baptist, former Catholic, former Calvary Chapel, former Assemblies of God. People who had been born again in other denominations, walked away from their church, and then joined the pro-gay church. So I thought, well, this to me is a great answer. And it's a funny thing about deception. If you're deceived, you tend not to be satisfied with that. You want to deceive others. It's almost like some virus you feel like you want to pass on. It wasn't enough for me just to say, okay, I believe this new way of looking at the Bible. I'll believe this reinterpretation. And even if I don't really believe it, I want to believe it. So doggone it, I'm going to tell myself I believe it. I'm going to embrace that. I'm going to embrace pro-gay theology. I'll be part of the gay church. But I also felt like, no, that's not enough. I need to persuade other people to do the same thing. And well, I was about to say in a way, not in a way, literally, I was doing through that work what I had largely been doing sexually, looking for somebody to validate me. Tell me that I'm okay being gay and Christian and that there's no contradiction. Let me minister to you. And I mean, it's a mixed bag. You know how motivations are. I can't say that there's ever just one thing motivating me at any given time. There are a lot of motivations, some good, some not. There were probably some decent motivations in there, but largely it was about, hey, let me help you embrace the idea that God made you gay and that it's good and that you need to accept it, because that will validate the decision I made. You see, so we can validate each other. We can convince each other. Doesn't that feel great? And I got to tell you, Andrew, it did. It was exhilarating for a season.
Yeah. So I imagine that's like a high, like a peak for that period.
It truly was. It truly was, because it felt like, oh, I no longer have to choose. I can finally be my whole self. I am a Christian and I am gay, and I don't have to say no to either one of them. Well, hallelujah, sounded good.
So how do you go from gay Christian, gay activist to then reconverting in some way, repenting? How do you get out of that rebellion? What was it that God
know what's the funniest thing? I am really grateful that God works with us very uniquely, considers our individual temperament. Just for example, when I was a teenager, now I was dating a girl, going to Calvary Chapel, going to services, sometimes 3 times a week for at least a couple of months before I myself said yes and received Christ. And one of the reasons I dug my heels in, besides just this whole idea of dying to self didn't sit well with me, but also the altar calls were so beautiful. but also very emotional, not emotional in the wrong sense, very moving emotionally.
Sure.
But something in me was like, wait a minute, if I go forward, how am I ever going to know whether or not I did that really because I believed it, or did I just get caught up in the moment?
Hmm.
And I've always been a rogue personally. I hope not in the wrong sense, but sometimes definitely. But anyway, I needed to know that it was just between me and God. So when I was born again, I never went forward at a church altar call. I ditched school during lunch, went to a park, sat under a tree and prayed. And that's where God met me, you see. So something similar happened in 1984 when I repented. I had a very rough time when I was a part of the gay community. I could not sustain a relationship for love or money. The longest I lasted with a guy, and I tried at least 5 different live-in relationships. The longest I lasted was 6 months. I mean, that's pathetic. It wouldn't be fair to say that that's the story of every openly gay man. That's not true. Besides my sexuality, I had huge problems with intimacy and authenticity with people. So I just couldn't sustain a relationship regardless. But the point is, I had a lot of emotional ups and downs. I started drinking way too much. I chain smoked, which is a problem, but that was not the worst of my problems. And I had a lot of depression. And so as a result, if I had repented during those very unhappy years, Andrew, I think it would have been easy for me to think, well, wait a minute, maybe I just am saying homosexuality is wrong because it isn't working out for me. And that's not repentance. That's more like convenience, you see?
Yeah.
By 1984, my life was going beautifully, but at least in the sense of I had a very good job. I was still active somewhat with the gay church, but I had stepped away from full-time ministry and decided I just was not going to be content doing that and that alone. I had a very active social life. I loved my apartment. I was in the best shape I'd ever been in. I had a lot of affirmation, a lot of fun. I mean, things were going very, very well. Then the conviction started hitting me more and more. And I think I had 2 things happening: the conviction of the Holy Spirit and my own conscience, that mechanism that was saying, do you really believe in what you're doing? And I think that that's a natural thing that God has given people. I happen to think that a high number of people who come to us for counseling are coming because there's a conflict between what they really believe and what they want to believe. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the greatest challenges any human can face is the challenge of asking, are you or are you not kidding yourself about, anything? About your marriage, about your habits, about your work, about the way you present yourself, any number of things. And that kept me up nights. And more I had to realize, I had to admit, I'm not feeling all this discomfort because my life is going badly. My life is going very well. And I'm still not okay. Now, we better really ask ourselves the tough question. For me, that was 2 tough questions. Am I in God's will? Because I knew God loved me. That wasn't... But am I in God's will? And then the second question, be honest, Joe, does it matter? Do you care whether or not you're in God's will? And I really wrestled with that one.
So many times what the accusation is that we're telling people that God doesn't love them if they're still involved in homosexuality.
Yeah.
And if they're struggling with some sort of sin or something. And you're like, you had a conviction that, no, I am still loved.
No question.
You had to know if you're still in his will and if you're doing what he wants. So there's that nagging question. That's interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, kind of off track, but it really gets my goat when I hear people say that, and you've heard it too, I'm sure, that, you people are out telling gays that God doesn't love them. I've been doing this work for 36 years now, Andrew. I was with Exodus International for years. I've been involved in this type of ministry since 1987. I ain't never once heard anybody say that God doesn't love gays. I've never heard anybody say that. I've never heard anybody say God doesn't love lesbians, gays, transgenders, bisexuals, what have you. But that's what we're often accused of doing. Regardless, yes, I knew God loved me. I had no question about that. But you got to ask yourself at one point, am I consistent with what I say? Can I, with any integrity, look at my life and say it pretty much matches what I say I believe?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we can't say that, and I'm not even trying to get all moralistic here, I'm just talking about basic mental and emotional health. If we can't say that, we're going to have some sort of dissonance going on within.
Yeah, you're talking about
That's
integrity.
what was happening to me.
Yeah.
And then I had to find, when it finally became clear, the dissonance is there because you made a rash decision in 1978. You abruptly walked out of everything that you believed in and said that your desire for this kind of relating and for that identity is now more of a priority to you than everything, to the wife you had, to the people who loved you, to the church you belonged to everything you said you stood for. This took precedent. And like Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you? Well, it wasn't. And that's what led me to finally say, okay, look. And again, I'm glad it happened. I was alone in my apartment. I knelt down, I started praying, and it was just a time when I had to really face what I had not wanted to face, which was great. But again, we call people to holiness. We call them to life. We call them to walk in the light. We call them to psychological health. We should. But we always got to remember there's a heck of a price you're going to pay if you do that. Because if you're going to really face life as it is and walk in the light and be authentic, you will have to look at the dark side. You'll have to look at some of the decisions you've made. You'll have to look at some of your own games, any number of things.
Yeah.
That's devastating. I mean, I think one of the scariest lines in all of the Bible is Nathan saying to David, thou art the man. Like you are like everything you say you're against. So that was a real beautiful and devastating time for me. Those from, I'd say 1984 for at least the first year and a half after that. So a lot of rebuilding and a lot of growth, a lot of introspection, a lot of repentance.
So let's dig into that period then. You realize, okay, I got to repent now.
Yeah.
Where do you go? And who received you? Who nurtured your growth from that point? What did God do?
Yeah. It was very lonely. I tell everybody I'm working with, this is a wonderful journey. This is a path that a lot of people have walked ever since Paul told the Corinthian church, such were some of you. Good. But this is, for most of us, a very, very, very lonely process. Doesn't have to be. I just think so often it is. It sure was for me. Well, I knew one of the first things I'd have to do is relocate. It was so clear. The next morning, I started making plans because I realized if I stay here, I lived in Long Beach, California at the time, a very well-connected gay community in Long Beach at the time, even more so now. All the friends I had, I lived just like within walking distance of 5 to 6 of my favorite gay bars, the associations I had, all of the familiarity. I knew I will not be able to make it if I stay where I am. I'll get sucked back into everything. I know I will. So I realized I'm going to have to relocate to another county, get involved in a Bible-believing church, and for heaven's sake, find a good counselor, And I was very, very blessed in that sense, Andrew, because it was devastating. For me, starting over meant really go to ground zero.
Yeah.
Because my whole identity, all my community, everything had been about gay, I did tell some of my closest friends what I had decided, and to their credit, they were respectful and understanding and basically said, well, if that's where you're at, okay, but it was very hard still emotionally for me, because you can't very well say I've come to realize my homosexuality is wrong without also by implication saying you're wrong too.
Yeah.
So anyway, it meant relocating, starting over, and getting grounded in a church was critical. And finding.
How open were you with the people at the church you're now going to about what your background was, where you were coming from?
Well, yes, this is an interesting point. when I went back to Calvary Chapel,
Okay.
and many of the people there had known me when I had been in the ministry earlier, and they had known about the scandal of my divorce, my gay activism, my gay identity, the gay church, the whole thing. They knew. So there were some people I had to disclose to, but especially initially, the guys that I connected with were guys I reconnected with. There were still some guys there who knew me. I didn't find them for months and months, but finally, because Calvary's a big mega church, and I didn't know who was there and who wasn't. But finally, I started getting more involved in the lifeblood of the church and started running into more guys who had known me, and we reconnected, and I apologized profusely, and they welcomed me. And so when you talk about the guys who nurtured you, the guys who welcomed me in welcomed me without too many questions. They were basically like, hey, you're back. We love you. Come be a part of our life. That was critical. And this was a different way of relating to them, because I had related to them as a minister, not just man to man. Now it was just man to man. So they were saying to me, join us, come to our, social events. And they invited me. I wound up on 3 softball teams at the same time, and I joined their choir, and I joined a men's study. And so there were some men who, as I was getting to know them, I told them, this is where I've been. And they were all pretty good about it. And if they had any weird feelings, they kept them to themselves. So I got to credit them with that. The men welcomed me back into the church, very, very much so. But
I'm thinking that must have been so healing to now be at more of a level playing field with these other guys, because it is so lonely being in ministry and being lonely at the top. When you're caring for others, there's often this barrier to being authentic with them at the same time.
For a lot of us who have been through this, Andrew, the problem started before we were aware of our sexual feelings. We were aware of feeling not a part of, a part of. And that carries into our adolescence, not a part of. I'm not one of the guys. And then into our adulthood, I'm not one of the guys. Now, the ministry can be a very convenient way of avoiding that dynamic, because you're in charge, you see? So you can love very safely. I can love you and serve you and preach to you and baptize you, but you ain't going to know me. That I'm overstating it, but really for me, that's largely what it was. And it wasn't like I want to be phony and put on this whole act. I meant the things I was saying, but it was one-dimensional. Now the healing, and I find this to be true. We can counsel people, good. My therapist was wonderful, a wonderful guy. Had great insights into my soul, great insights into my fears of intimacy, into my rage, into my woundedness, into my deficits. I mean, all of that was great. So as a consultant, as a source of insight, and certainly as a bonded mentor, he was wonderful. But the real healing happened in relationship, not in the therapeutic relationship as such, but the one-to-one and group relations I was starting to establish with men. I swear, Andrew, I still remember this so clearly. I finally, after months of being at Calvary alone and just spending so much time by myself, really, I'd go to work, I'd come home, I'd work out, I'd go to church, then come home alone and just sit, When I got together for a big volleyball game they were having. The guys invited me to. I played, we had fun, and then they said, hey, tonight we're having a barbecue. We got a bunch of people coming over. Why don't you come over? I was manic. I mean, manic. I felt like I had just been pumped with, 12 cups of coffee. I went home and jumped in the shower, and I was singing at the top of my lungs, and I felt like a kid who had finally been asked to be a part of something. And, it was huge for me, because I felt like I finally belong. And that for me was the beginning of challenging a lot of the lies I had believed about myself, because now I had tangible proof. These guys just didn't know me as a minister. When they knew me as a minister, they could say, well, we love you, meaning what? Well, we love your gifts, or we love what you offer. This was just, I had no gifts to offer. I was just plain old me. Yeah. And they were saying, be part of our lives. That started to undo, you see, so much of what I had accumulated over years. So many of the misconceptions.
You stepped into
that was invaluable.
it kind of shows how you had previously stepped into spiritual fatherhood when you still needed to be spiritually fathered and spiritually
Hugely.
brothered. You need to be like a child again and go through those stages of growth before you could get to that place where you can really be a mentor and a minister to others.
Hey, this again, somewhat off topic, but this is a real concern to me. I do think we can, in the church, too quickly raise up people based on their gifting, but not look at their character, not look at their own growth, because the gifting tends to come before that. I was very gifted to teach and to preach and to play the piano and so forth, long before I was psychologically prepared to take on all the challenges and the stressors of ministry. So it was all well and good that the gifting was there, but that alone is not a good enough reason to raise people up. There needs to be the growth and the maturing and the healing where it's needed. And obviously, nobody winds up in ministry perfected. There's always work to do. That's true. But there is a level of maturity and wholeness that we should be looking for. And sometimes the gifting obscures that because we think, well, if somebody is very gifted, they must be very Christ-like and very emotionally healthy and very whole. Why do we think that? Darned if I know, but we tend to think it. And so in this case, I was able to get back to the growth aspect that I had kind of passed over. It's like finally taking algebra. When you skipped over that and you went straight into chemistry, something's going to give us.
I'm so confused. What am I doing?
Yeah.
It's one of the things I tell people a lot is it's an error I've seen in some of the ministries that we've been involved in. I think there's a lot of promotion of people too quickly, or at least put them out there as spokespeople too quickly. And like, you look at Paul. When Paul had his conversion, he didn't immediately become a missionary. He went off into seclusion.
Right.
And that's where he got developed. He got broken down and God grew him. And then when he came back, it was Barnabas who brought him back into the fold. And they didn't just go off in ministry on its own. He went off in pairs. He went in teams. So there was still accountability and still continued mentoring and growth. He had a ton of gifting. He had plenty of knowledge. He was a Pharisee. It's not like he was ignorant of God's word. So, but there still need to be the proving. And it has to be done with patience. When we have this urgency, the ministry comes first. We need to hurry up and get the ministry out there. Do this, do that. The needs of the ministry come first. We burn people out, and then we end up having scandal. That's inevitably the result.
We have to take some responsibility for being complicit in that. I was responsible for my scandal. I sinned. I rebelled. I made the decisions. I do think along the way, as if wishing does any good, but I wish that people at that time had been willing to look more at how I was doing as a man than just what I was doing for the church. Because in those early years of ministry, Andrew, I certainly wasn't living a double life. I mean, when I was those early years of ministry, I was absolutely living a very separated and a perfectly clean life. Nothing wrong in that. But nobody ever once, I mean, our work hours were like, easily 15 hours a day or longer in those days. And it was all just the ministry. And I don't remember anybody ever even asking me how I was doing. Nobody ever even thought in terms of, gee, do you need some time off? Do you need a sabbatical? Do you need to rest more? Now, do you have healthy relationships? Is there some play in your life? Whatever. Never. At least in the circles I was in. And that's a setup for a lot of problems. And I don't think it's any coincidence that so many of our marriages ended in divorce and so many of us wound up in the wilderness. I don't think it's a coincidence at all.
So what a blessing to have kind of started over. You wanted to go into being an addictions counselor.
I sure
but then
did.
You started working with guys.
That was so weird.
With the SSA issues, same-sex attraction issues. But, I mean, you're in California, and that's the birthplace of the whole ex-gay ministry movement. Were there ex-gay ministries in the area, or at least some small support groups? Was there anything around you at that time?
Andrew, there were, but I didn't know about them. I'd never heard of such a thing.
Wow.
Never heard of such a thing. By the time I repented, Exodus had been around for about 8 years, but I was not aware of it.
Wow.
And even when I looked for help, I had no idea. There were, in California, we did have Desert Stream Ministries in Anaheim at that time. I didn't know about them. So I didn't know about any of this. And this is why I laugh about the whole thing. I wanted to be a licensed marriage and family therapist who dealt with addictions, treated addictions, I should say.
Yeah.
And as I said, I couldn't get an internship anywhere, and I had good grades, good references, all that. This one church had started this new thing. They were counseling people from a clinical perspective who were struggling with homosexuality. And my internship, our director, had said, well, you could sign up there. She didn't know that had been part of my life. And she said, this is an interesting thing you might want to look into. And I said, not on your life. And I said, I said, that was part of my life. I've put it behind me. I was engaged by then. I thought, number one, I don't ever want to talk about that again. That's in the past. And number two, and I really meant this, Andrew, I want to raise a family. There is no way I could make a living counseling people who deal with that.
Wow.
Because there may be 10 such people on the whole planet. So I thought, oh, no, who could make a living doing a thing like that? It was only when I finally agreed to take it, because it was the only door open. I had maybe, 5 clients I was seeing under supervision weekly. We sponsored a conference at that time. Andy Comiskey was one of our speakers, Cy Rogers, Steve Arterburn, Jan Frank. And at that conference, there were like 300 people or so that showed up, which was much more than we expected. And then we announced that we were offering counseling to people who struggle with this. My client load went up to 20. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, maybe my story isn't so unique. Maybe there are a lot of guys out there like me, and I just never realized it. So I was doing all that, Andrew, before I ever heard of Exodus or anything of that sort. In fact, the conference we sponsored, when I first met Cy and Andy, that was when I first heard of Exodus International.
Okay.
And got a sense of, oh, there's this whole network out there. Huh, that's interesting.
So then how'd you start getting involved with Exodus?
No, Cy is largely responsible for that. I did start speaking just for the ministry. That by then I had started my own ministry, and we had a clinical supervisor. I still wanted to go for the marriage and family therapist license, but I was starting to speak at churches, giving my own testimony and talking about what worked in my life. And I was pretty green, but some of the things I was learning, And Cy heard me speak at a conference, and he came up to me afterwards and said, now you really need to pursue this. I think you could go somewhere with it. Would you come to Exodus, our next Exodus conference, which I did, 1987. And then
was Cy president at that time?
Cy was president. And then within a couple, Cy and I worked together quite a few times after that, and we got to be pretty good friends. And by then I married, and I was coming to different conferences he was a part of. And in 1989, he asked me if I would run for the board. And nobody knew who I was. I didn't know anybody, not really. And I said, I think that's a long shot, Cy. I don't know anyone, but he said, just throw your hat in the ring, please. Would you, just as a personal favor to me? So I thought, oh, what the heck, and they did elect me to the board, but Mr. Rogers pulled a fast one on me. I was elected as a board member. And then at my first board meeting, because this was Cy's last term, they needed to elect a new president. And at the meeting, giving me no warning, Cy said, I nominate Joe Dallas for president.
That's crazy.
And I just was floored. And, I think in retrospect, it's probably a good idea that somebody serve on the board at least a couple terms before they're president, might help.
Yeah.
But what the heck, ever the dummy that says yes, I say, oh, well, okay, sure, I'll be president. So that's basically how I wound up doing the work I did with Exodus.
You were president from what years?
1991 to 1993. 91 to 93. It was a 3-year term.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Or actually, it's a 1-year term, and you can serve a maximum of 3 terms. Then you have to get off. So, yeah.
Gotcha. What were those years like for you, serving with Exodus?
They were wonderful and they were bewildering. They were wonderful in that I saw a much broader perspective of how this was impacting the church. The church needed to respond. I was learning about what we would call cutting edge ministry. I was doing a lot of media work and a lot of speaking, as well as my own counseling and working with Exodus. That was wonderful. Now, it was bewildering because I was still getting to know the people I was serving.
Mm-hmm.
My first year, I was a lousy president. My second year, I was okay. I might say I was reasonably good by my third year, but it was on the job training. And I don't think that's such a good thing in hindsight, but I'll always thank God for that honor. And it was an honor. I mean, to serve with Exodus International in any capacity, Andrew, was a huge honor.
Yeah.
Of course, there were things I saw that I disagreed with. But when you talk about Exodus, you've got to remember, people talk about Exodus as a ministry. That's not quite true. Exodus was a network of ministries. It's almost like Exodus was the phone book.
Yep.
The people listed in the phone book. Now, some people don't even know what I'm talking about. There was a thing called a phone book once upon a time in a faraway galaxy. But Exodus was the network that connected the ministries. It was not itself a ministry. It was a corporate network of individual ministries that were each incorporated on their own.
Yeah.
And so at times, I believe that some Exodus leaders and or ministries would either overemphasize the spiritual at the expense of a realistic look at the emotional. There were sometimes some leaders would have either what I would call overpromised a change prognosis and basically said, if you follow these steps, you'll be temptation free for life. Others, I think, might have taken an approach I would not have taken when it comes to gender identity. I never believed, just for example, that people are all well served if you tell them, well, you need to act a little more masculine. Let's work on the way you stand, the way you speak, the way you dress, the way, I think that is all well and good if you feel the need to do that. And there may be the need for that. But by and large, that doesn't indicate a change in either sexual desires or in general wholeness. I mean, when I was part of the gay community, some of the most masculine men I've ever known, stereotypically masculine, were very openly gay, and as well as some of the most stereotypically feminine women. So, but those were, I would say, much more the exception than the rule. By and large, I think Exodus remained a very responsible, Christ-centered, very sincere network of leaders and ministries. And you probably know this as well as I, Andrew. When Exodus closed its doors, people mistakenly often say, oh, well, that was the end of all those ministries. Why, that's nonsense. Most of the ministries, well, I would say, most of them, many of the ones that are still thriving today were Exodus ministries. Yeah. So we were not, myself included, we weren't dependent on Exodus to keep going. Exodus was a good networking and a very good work.
It was more of a tool for people on the outside. For me, as just someone who was more of an advocate and a resource for people, when they contact me and they're like, I need help. I wasn't a therapist for many years, but I knew I could refer them to Exodus. Here, go to their ministry, find a ministry tool, and you could find something in your area. So for me, it was a loss that there wasn't that tool readily available. And it took me a while to learn that there was a Restored Hope Network now. And not every ministry that was part of Exodus joined RHN, or even the other ministry that kind of took up some of the other ministries. They changed their name recently, but I forget the name right now. Sorry, Derek.
I know what you mean, and I've forgotten it too. Oh man, that's going to bother me at 2 a.m. I'm going to give you a call.
Transformational.
No.
It's something. They changed the name recently, so it's something Transformational Ministries. So anyway, I'll come up with it later. But a lot of them, like say I was doing my internship at Day 7 Ministries, and then I worked for them. And when Exodus closed, they didn't join another network. They just kept being independent, doing their thing. Briefly, I know we got to kind of wind down here, but if there are any myths that you would like to dispel about Exodus or just ex-gay ministries or the whole ministry space in general that we work in.
Sure.
Which myths would you like to dispel briefly?
Well, first, the myth of Exodus being monolithic. As I said, we were not. We were not. Exodus was a network of individual ministries representing every denomination and virtually every kind of ministerial approach, whether Catholic or high church or Pentecostal or whatever, you know. So we were not monolithic in that sense. We all had to agree to a statement of faith, of course. But beyond that, Exodus ministries were very much like radio shows you hear if you listen to Christian radio. If you listen to Christian radio, you'll hear people who are in agreement on the basics. After that, all bets are off. You know what I mean? Some of them will be what you'd call charismatic, some will be Baptist, some will be pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, whatever. You'll hear variation, and that was true with Exodus. So I think that was certainly, that is one of the myths, is that we were all saying the same thing, and what we were all saying was, Jesus has saved us and set us completely free, so we no longer have any homosexual temptations, rah. That's not what it was like at all. That's really not true. Another is that we all subscribed to the same psychological theories of development and so forth, and that was not true. Some ministries took a more clinical approach, some took a more discipleship-oriented approach, some were individual counseling, some were group, and everything in between. I think that it is wrong also to say that Exodus was this place where people were oppressing each other. I've heard people who now speak out against Exodus saying that the Exodus environment was very oppressive. You couldn't be yourself, you couldn't be honest, and you were basically told you have to conform to this certain mold. Good grief. I felt if there was any problem with Exodus, it was the other extreme. I felt that we were extremely free, and sometimes it got a little scary how open people would be about different things, you know, and I don't mean in a terrible way, but I just mean at Exodus, I believe there was a tremendous amount of freedom to be honest about struggles and temptations that you would not normally be honest about. So I would hear people talk openly about masturbation, which was something I wasn't accustomed to, Andrew. It wasn't like people were getting too graphic about themselves, but just even the topic was freely discussed. Lust as a problem was freely discussed. Different emotional struggles people had. I thought we were pretty open to being open with each other. And so I think that is certainly a myth about Exodus. I think one of the biggest myths about Exodus is that it somehow was out there influencing gay people to make a decision to go straight. Andrew, we couldn't have done that if you were paying us to do it. You can't do that. Exodus was up to its necks with people who had already had an encounter with God by which they realized this is not the way I'm meant to live. They made that decision before coming to Exodus. Then they came to Exodus saying, this is the direction I want my life to go. Will you help me? Mm-hmm. Exodus didn't initiate that with people. We couldn't have initiated that with people. This is one of the reasons why I, again, kind of get my dander up when I hear people talking about leaving Exodus saying, well, Exodus influenced me to do this and they coerced me into doing that. Mm-hmm. No, we didn't, and we couldn't have if we tried. And I think it's very unfair to say, I made a decision in my life to follow a certain course. I looked for somebody to help me on that course. Then I changed my mind about the direction I wanted to go. Oh, well, it's all your fault. No, wait a minute. Yeah. You know, there are two big questions there. One, did you make the right decision? And two, did I ever unduly influence you to make the wrong one? Not true. So those are, I guess, the ones that come to my mind when we talk about myths about Exodus or even what they call ex-gay ministry. Primarily, I was listening just this morning to a sermon by Alistair Begg, and he's one of my favorite pastors, teachers, what have you. And coincidentally, he was talking about Romans 1, and he started talking about, of all things, conversion therapy. And he said, there is this thing out there that they call conversion therapy. And Mr. Begg said, you know, all that really amounts to is people who are wanting to talk about their sexual struggles, getting pastoral or counseling care and exploring what they can do about it. And yet the world is making it out to be this monster called conversion therapy. And I was encouraged to hear that from someone of his stature, because you and I have been saying that for some time now.
Yeah.
But the point is, I think that one of the common misconceptions about any kind of ministry similar to what we do is that we are either influencing people to make a change that they don't really want to make, or that we are doing something exotic with people.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a fly on the wall of my office for the last 35 years, you would be one bored fly, because I talk and I listen and I take notes. That's it. And that's pretty much run of the mill for what all of us do. I do close my sessions with prayer, but even then I don't anoint people with oil, for heaven's sake.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what people are refusing to see, and this I think is kind of the bottom line crux issue, what people are refusing to see is that no matter what the social trends are, there will always be women and men who are going to say, I'm not okay pursuing these sexual desires. I have decided that I will not pursue them. Will somebody talk to me about what I can expect, what steps I should take, how I can live the healthiest life, and what potential I may have for a heterosexual response, and to what extent I don't have such potential, how can I best live with celibacy unless and until? Now, people like that deserve service. They deserve clinical care. They deserve ministerial care. You don't have to agree with them. I get that. But they certainly deserve to be served.
Yeah.
And this is where I feel a terrible injustice is being done to literally millions of people who are in the same position I was in. God be praised, I was able to freely find help when I wanted it. So they should be able to as well.
Yeah. With all your years of experience, how do you hope to see it passed on?
Mm-hmm.
The work you've been doing.
Well, of course, when you pass the baton, Andrew, you expect that the person you pass it to is going to look at what you did, and they'll look at it critically. And that is their responsibility. So when I look at these younger ministries coming up, and some of them are saying, well, I would have done it differently than you did, I think, good, that's what you're supposed to say. Mm-hmm. You are supposed to say, now, how can we improve what they did? And I hope the people will. I think that more than ever, this kind of work needs to be mainstreamed into the church. I'd like to see us moving more in cooperation with the local congregation, so that more local congregations will be equipped. In fact, a big passion of mine right now, and I would like to see that passed on. I'd like to see other people take it up even more. Equip the local church to do what we've been doing. There will always be a need for guys like us who offer themselves either as therapists, counselors, mentors, whatever you wish to call us, sort of do the specialized coaching, therapy, what have you. But the lifeblood of the work needs to be done within the church. So I'm hoping that our materials can be more mainstreamed. Whatever principles we've learned that are of value to pastors and leaders, especially youth leaders these days, good grief, they're facing this in unprecedented ways. Yeah. I also am hoping that this kind of ministry will take up more and more the challenge of apologetics. It unfortunately, it's not fair, but there it is. It's not enough to be adept at what we do. We also have to be adept at defending what we do.
Yep.
And that isn't right. That's like somebody who's an EMT all of a sudden having to defend why he's helping people who've been injured. But that doesn't change the fact that it's what we have to do. We have to be theologically well-grounded enough that from a biblical perspective and from a reasonably credible clinical perspective, be able to explain why we do what we do. Yeah. This is where I think the big challenge is going to be going into the next couple of decades, as long as we're here.
No, totally agree. I had someone trying to debate me, an old friend of my brother's, found me on Facebook, and he's like, oh, you're a conversion therapist, all this stuff. And so I'm like, why don't you check some of my videos? So he watches some of my videos and he's like, why are you so apologetic? I'm like, think about it, dude. Who are they attacking? Who are they trying to ban and outlaw? Of course I got to be apologetic.
Well, that's really funny, because the guy on the one hand says, I accuse you. And then he turns around and said, why are you making a defense?
Yeah.
Well, I guess when you're accused, you better do something, you know?
Yeah. Well, thank you for all your years of service. And no, you're not done, because I think I mentioned this to you when I've seen you in person, like it seems like you're putting out more content than ever, and God is still using you in new ways and innovative ways. And so I'm happy to see that you are still contributing so much to this whole field and training people up.
Well, thank you. It's an honor. I hope to do it long as I can still sit up and talk coherently.
You did.
I love what I do. I really do. And I so appreciate what you have added to it. I mean, your materials are giving a clarity to this issue that we have needed. You're a vital part of this work. Very vital.
Thank you. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining me. Have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll let you know when I drop this. All right.
Thank you. All right,
Take
Andrew.
care.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Yeah. So there you have it. That's Joe Dallas. I could have definitely been asking him more questions and picking his brain for another hour at least. I'm just so grateful that he gave me the time he had. He had another client right afterwards. So I just want to thank Joe once again. And there's a lot of different parts of his story that he shared. I drilled into his story more than I first intended because I think him sharing so much of his own life and his own experiences of his own healing and growth and what contributed to the path that he went down could be a blessing to others who may relate. So I hope you're blessed by that. Please check out his channel. He's got a couple of YouTube channels, just Joe Dallas, as well as one that he started based on his latest book, Christians in a Cancel Culture. So it's Joe Dallas, Christians in a Cancel Culture. And check out his books. I mean, I kind of do free advertising for him here. I always got some of his books up. I know for a long time the Complete Christian Guide to Understanding Homosexuality was on my bookshelf in plain view while I was doing videos. And his other book, Desires in Conflict, I think that was his first book he ever wrote. The first book of his I ever read was A Strong Delusion, which I read during my internship in college, and he does an excellent job in that book of explaining the whole gay rights movement, gay theology, but approaching it in a very understanding way because he's coming from that background himself. So that book helped me to have more of a heart of compassion toward those who were actually treating me like an enemy. And so even though I'm very I've got a fighting spirit when it comes to people trying to ban our work and to outlaw what we and really deceive the church and deceive the masses in general. I try to understand where they're coming from instead of just denigrating and demonizing them. And that book was instrumental for me. So it was just an honor to speak with him. So for you who are watching, I just want to remind you, just like we were saying, Jesus loves you freely, fully, faithfully, and fruitfully. God bless.